Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Bodo and I'm co-presenting this together with Marcus Perlman. And I just wanted to briefly say thanks to the organizers for making this conference possible. And thank you for tuning in today. So it's already been mentioned at the previous talk that the literature on musical timbre is very much focused on musical instruments. Of course, that's only a tiny fraction of the soundscapes that we experience on a daily basis. And I invite you tomorrow, maybe after the first day of this conference, when you go outside and you're listening around you, it's very likely that no matter where you live, you will listen to some birds. And people have been fascinated by birds for centuries. And because of that, there's a really rich tradition of, in particular, birders and ornithologists describing bird songs in painstaking detail. So here I actually have a field guide, and these field guides are used by birders when they go into the field, and there's descriptions in there where they use the description to identify the particular sound. And so because there's dozens or hundreds of these field guides, we can use that to study Crossmodal language and onomatopoeia and how they are used to communicate sound concepts in this domain. Oops, let me see that this works. Okay, so just to set the stage, I think you're all quite on the same plate with this, but just to remind ourselves of why it's important to study the language of timbre. That's for one, because a lot of timbre methodology is language mediated. Language is used as an access into the perceptual spaces. In a recent quote by Zachary Walmark, he says that much of the perceptual literature on musical timbre includes an explicit or implicit linguistic component. And Marcus and I, we have a background in cognitive science, but we are currently located at a linguistics department. And so we hope to bring some linguistics to the table and make connections between the timbre literature and things that have been said in linguistics, actually. And of course, timbre language is an interesting object of study in its own right. So we can use discourses of timbre to probe the underlying perceptual spaces because language reflects thought. And so this is particularly in the exciting new cognitive linguistic tradition referenced in some papers by, for example, Zachary Walmark, and we see our work much in line with this. But now moving to birds, I just briefly want to play some bird song to you. This is the black and white warbler, which you may, for example, hear if you're going on a field trip in the US. And when you're listening to this, I'm going to play this video in a second. When you're listening to this, I want you to imagine how you would describe that auditory percept to another person. So there we go. If you're trying to now describe this, imagine that if you're writing one of these books and you're one of these authors and you are faced with this task, you have to actually describe this in such painstaking detail that somebody in the field may actually be able to identify the bird using your linguistic description. And moreover, then also identify this bird against other similar sounding birds. And so we can then look at what are the communicative strategies that are used to make this possible. Now, just as a background on this, it's been known for a long time in early psychological studies that auditory experience in general, not just timbre language, is hard to verbalize. So for example, in studies where you give auditory stimuli to participants and ask them to describe them, you find quite a diversity of different linguistic strategies being used and also not much agreement. And this is then also the case with timbre language, where it's been said that the description of timbre lacks specific sensory vocabulary, and there's tons of musicians and also researchers who've been complaining about the inadequacy of timbre vocabulary. And I just want to briefly make a nod to linguistics here, because this problem has actually been discussed independently of timbre studies in linguistics under the banner of ineffability, the being at a loss of words. And specifically, Levinson and Majid argue that particular sensory impressions are harder to talk about than others. And we have since then actually quantified this in a recent cognition paper where we look at a large sensory vocabulary of English adjectives, sensory descriptors that are used for particular modalities. So here you're seeing primarily visual words, primarily auditory words, primarily touch-based words. And what we find is that there are actually 3 times as many visual adjectives in the English language compared to sound adjectives in general. And also the visual adjectives are used more frequently. So English speakers tend to have a preference for verbalizing visual experience above and beyond auditory experience. To that extent, then it makes sense that visual experience has much more nuance, and there's not that many words that are available for expressing sound concepts. And so this is a sort of a quantitative linguistic thing that is happening alongside these claims that have been happening in the Timbre literature. But of course, that doesn't mean that it's impossible to talk about Timbre, because when you have a lack of specific vocabulary, you can make up with other discourse strategies. And in a recent paper by Citis, he has this nice graph where we have imitation and onomatopoeia as strategies for communicating Timbre concepts. We also have the option of doing comparisons, like it sounds like a guitar, it sounds like a blender, and therefore being able to communicate sound impressions. And then one of the things that's really important is metaphor. So it's been observed that timbre words come a lot from, are borrowed from other sensory modalities, particularly vision and touch, bright, soft, rough, and so on. And here too, I just want to briefly, before we get to our actual study, mention that this has actually been sort of independently discovered in linguistics. And unfortunately, in the linguistic literature, there's a sort of neglect of the timbre literature because this work wasn't known by those authors. But there's decades worth of research showing across very different text types that touch words are more likely to be used to describe sound concepts than the other way around. These are so-called synesthetic metaphors, and people have established this hierarchy where touch is used crossmodally to talk about the other senses rather than the reverse. And this is based on corpus analysis of real texts. Okay, so with this as background, let's quickly go into the data. And specifically, if you open up one of these field guides, you may read a description like this. So if you look at this description, one of the things that might strike you is that there are lots of different sensory adjectives being used. And some of these seem familiar from the Timbre literature, but also we have lots of onomatopoeias. In this particular, for this one bird, we have multiple onomatopoeias to describe or depict the song. And so what we did to do this in a large scale basis, we actually transcribed these field guides that you see here on this side and a few more, including scraping some online resources. We have 6,000 bird entries or vocalization descriptions being annotated, 17 field guides, covering 2,800 bird species, which is there's about 10,000 species on the planet. So it's a good quarter of the birds on this planet. And our corpus comprises 110,000 words to describe bird vocalizations. And so what I'm showing you here is, by the way, for everything that is going to be data, you can have the data that we use, the corpus and everything is available, including the reproducible code under this GitHub link. What I'm showing you here is sensory adjectives, because these are the ones that come up most in Timbre studies, such as adjective rating studies. And so these are the most frequent ones. So the size here of this word cloud represents frequency. We have sharp and harsh being the most frequent, followed by soft, high-pitched, and so on. And of course, we don't know what sort of auditory object bird vocalizations are for humans from a perceptual perspective, and whether timbre is actually the primary dimension that matters in describing this. So just one way of showing that this is relevant to timbre studies is to just show that the timbre words that are commonly featured in studies, and here's just 3 recent ones, actually a lot of the descriptors do also occur in our bird vocalization corpus. And specifically when it comes to Zachary Womack's study, this is a corpus analysis of timbre words in orchestration treatises and instrument manuals. And we can use the frequencies, the word frequencies of the Timbre descriptors in the musical language and compare them with the frequencies in our corpus. And what we actually find is that even though there's a lot of overlap in the terms being used, the specific Timbre descriptors, they are not actually correlated in frequency. So what that means is that those words that are frequent in the musical discourse aren't necessarily those that are more frequent in the bird discourse. Suggesting that these are two very different have very different vocabularies associated with them when you actually go into the detail. Here what I'm showing you is the words that are most overrepresented in the bird discourse against instrument timbres. And we have sharp, soft, deep, shrill, and so on. And compared to this, on the right-hand side, these are the most underrepresented, and that means comparatively more frequent in the musical discourse. We have brilliant, dark, and so on. And I find it particularly interesting here that sharp and soft, which are more relating to touch, are at the top most overrepresented, and brilliant and dark, and also bright, which are more related to vision, feature among the more underrepresented terms. Okay, when it comes to the crossmodality of this, we can use a set of adjective ratings that have been collected by Leonard and Connell. And by the way, if you are a Timbre language researcher, I highly recommend looking into this data set, where basically words have been rated by native speakers on how much they correspond to touch, how much they correspond to vision, and so on, for each of the 5 common senses. And we can use this vocabulary then, this is this data, we can use that as a baseline to look at how many of those words come up in our corpus of bird vocalization descriptions. And so no smell words, very few taste words, and in particular, the only one that's really frequent is sweet. And 26% of the touch words from this database are used in our bird vocalization corpus, but also 28% of the visual words. And in comparison, only 22% of the auditory words. And so that's interesting, really showing you how crossmodal this language is and sort of quantifying the crossmodality, that even touch and vision are more frequent or more often to be used in something that is actually about sound. Okay, the other dominant strategy that we found in this corpus were onomatopoeias. And here I'm showing you the most frequent syllables, chip, p, ku, si, and so on. And in fact, actually 4,000 of the entries contain onomatopoeias, and that's 70% of the corpus. And if we compare that to musical timbre, based on Walmark's corpus analysis, that's only 2% of the descriptions were onomatopoeic. So that suggests that in this discourse, onomatopoeia is very dominant. And it fits with some research by Guillaume Lemaitre and colleagues, which suggests that imitation in general is a really good strategy for communicating sound concepts. And in fact, we find that onomatopoeia is even more frequent than comparisons. So things like, it sounds like a flute, are actually less frequent than just having onomatopoeias. Oops. And they're often combined with metaphorical adjectives. So we have things like a sharp, zvi, si, vit, a crisp pick, a clear sillet. And so these two different discourse strategies are not actually mutually exclusive. Onomatopoeia is used together with metaphorical adjectives. And I briefly want to look at the phoneme frequencies across the different onomatopoeias. And what we find here is the ones that are most frequent are voiceless obstruents, much more so than voiced obstruents. So we have sounds like s, ch, k, t, which all have high spectral sensors, which are used to in the onomatopoeias, which vibes well with the fact that birdsong in general has high frequency spectral components. And so b, g, d, which are lower in their frequencies, tend to be not so used. Okay, so to wrap up then, the discourse strategies that we see used here is we see very few source-based language, a lot of onomatopoeia as well as metaphor, and very similar to what's been observed for other musical timbres, we find a lot of vision and touch. In future directions, one of the things that we want to do is we want to incorporate the actual acoustics. So looking at the acoustic correlates of the bird songs and then correlating that with the particular discourse strategies. And one of the things that we've already begun to do, but haven't had the time to wrap up, is to actually do a latent semantic analysis of the, looking at what are the different dimensions within the semantic space of our corpus. And that's work that we'll do in the future. And with this, I want to say thank you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bodo. So any questions? I think that Professor Cariani has hand raised.
No, it's from last time. Sorry, I need to.
Okay, so I had hand raised. Okay. Any more questions? Well, I would really attempt a suggestion that within this incorporation of acoustic analysis together with the linguistic analysis, I think that there is a good advantage, the fact that at least from the point of view of stimuli, it doesn't seem to have a very strong cultural effects on the possible relationships between the acoustics and the stimuli and the semantics. Despite the fact that I was really surprised to know that there is such a huge number of bird species.
No, but that's a very good point, actually. So one of the nice things about birds as an acoustic from the for the acoustic study of it is that there's a really good database. It's called Xenocanto, which actually people that go into the field, they can upload their own bird vocalizations that have recorded in the field. And so there's a massive amount of recordings across the entire globe that we can tap into. And we can then actually download all of this birdsong. It's freely available, and actually then correlate that with the descriptions that we find in the field guides. And I totally agree with you that it's a really nice sort of new auditory object to study for timbre, because it's less dependent on particular musical traditions.
Right. I think that we have a couple of questions. One is from Gabriel Zuckerberg. Yeah. Did you determine the frequency of common cross-modal morphemes in English, like gl or str for onomatopoeias versus novel ones?
Aha, no, that's an interesting suggestion. So we focus on this sort of stuff, but actually we haven't made that combination yet with looking at onomatopoeias outside of the bird context and looking at which ones of those are overrepresented in the bird vocalizations. So I think that's a really good suggestion. Yeah.
Okay. There's a second question from John van der Wert. Have you done any research into how these words are used in musical creationism? I wonder how this research can be used in tandem with musical realism, how music can copy these words. And just like how a screen can be copied by music, text can be copied by music, of course.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. So what's interesting about this is, I mean, for one, it's just as a sort of background, birds song has always been compared to music, and actually composers have long since have compositions that mimic particular bird songs. And that's actually the early tradition of bird song research has used musical notation, but to transcribe bird songs. But there's also been suggestions that the similarity between music and birdsong is overstated. So there's a few new papers which suggest that actually pitch variation, which of course is very important for Western music, is not as important for birds, and that they're actually more tuned into spectral characteristics. And I think from this perspective, the fact that our that the musical frequencies are not correlated with the frequencies we find in our corpus suggests that these are somewhat, it's in line with this idea that perhaps the comparison to music between birdsong is a little bit overstated. But yeah, as I'm not a music researcher, I would actually be really interested in knowing more about that question. So yeah.
Well, as John also points, Messiaen was one of the biggest composers that really got inspiration from birds. Mm-hmm. And we have Claudia for a question. Claudia, would you like to unmute your Zoom?
Yeah, thank you for this very fascinating talk. I had two questions. The first question was about onomatopoeia. So you've looked only into English guidebooks about birds.
Yeah. And
I was wondering, how they would differ in different languages. Because, I mean, we know that, for example, animals, they don't have the same onomatopoeia in different languages. Like the sound of a dog is not the same in English as in French. And, and so I was wondering, how would, like, if you had to ask people to describe the sound of a bird, how would that differ with language? And because you said it's less prone to cultural differences like music, but I think it's still prone to language differences. And
I 100% agree with you. So, I mean, definitely language is a sort of filter. I mean, if you're thinking about the process of you have the acoustics, and then if you do onomatopoeia, you're filtering that through your linguistic system. And so there are going to be linguistic differences. I have two things to say to this. So we haven't looked at other languages yet, but what's really nice about birds is that there's a really big ethnobiological tradition on bird descriptions in other languages as well. And we actually can then look at what are onomatopoeias in other languages for the same birds that we have in our corpus. And that would be a really cool thing to do.
And that's lots of work.
But just one thing is, I think the differences between languages in onomatopoeia are perhaps sometimes at least a little bit overstated. So Marcus and I, we just have a new submission that hopefully comes out in Current Biology soon, where we found that words for rough surfaces across hundreds of languages have trilled sounds in them, trilled R's. And so there's a sort of really strong connection between texture words and a very universal way of encoding that in onomatopoeic forms. And so I think actually, if you're doing cross-language comparisons, while particular things may be very different, once you do a broad sweep comparison, you actually find a lot of similarities across languages. Yeah.
And I had a second question, but I think we're probably running out of time. So I can ask it later at the other town.
Okay. Since I can see that there's a growing interest in the topic, I would really dare to give speech to Caris for a last question, for a 1 minute question, even if the whole schedule goes a little bit back. Caris, would you like to?
Sure. Thank you, Kostas. And thank you, Bodo, for a great talk. So you showed that work that has been done in linguistics for in anthropology, I think, and I am aware of some of these works where touch seems to be, let's say, a proto-sense in the sense of qualities, describing sensory qualities. But then you also mentioned some work that shows that, for example, in English, the dominating sense in terms of vocabulary seems to be vision, which in that other research is at the end together with audition. So these are the two senses that seem to have absorbed, let's say, qualities from touch. So what is your take on that? And what does that tell us about how we describe senses in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So both vision and touch are used quite a lot to talk about other domains, but I think that they are talked about in very different things. So if you look at how visual metaphors are used in music, for example, a lot of it is used for structural things, for things that you can easily express in spatial relations. So for example, melodies and looking at compositions, and there's work that actually has looked at compositions and has found that visual spatial metaphors are extremely frequent in that particular domain. And I think touch in particular is very much tied to timbre. So vision is good because it makes relations available between objects, but touch seems to be much more tied in with the sort of spectral characteristics of sounds. And I think, yeah, our work is sort of in line with that tradition.
Okay, yeah, I think I get that. Intuitively, I think that's, yeah. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I'm going to do some shameless self-advertising here, but I've written a book that's called Sensory Linguistics, which is specifically on metaphors between different sensory modalities.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, I am aware.
Look at it. Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yes, I'm also aware of that book. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bodo. So let's go on. Let's proceed with the final talk from Magnus Lindberg from the City University of Hong Kong regarding a cross-modal resemblance between auditory and visual percepts using under a scope of a time series analysis method which was originally created for econometrics. I'm talking about the Granger causality. So, for Magnus, you have speech.
Thank you. Let's see if I can do this. Yeah, no, sorry, I'm at a conference right now. I'm giving my talk, so please don't disturb. No, sorry, please. No, right now, the guard came in here to wondering what I'm doing because it's close to midnight here in Hong Kong. So, but I have permission to be here and to give this presentation to you. Can you all hear me? Is my level okay? Give me a sign, please.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will probably disappoint in at least two ways. So the first one is that we're in the session of semantic